and today we have a very, very special new member introduction. So I will welcome Blake Mormon with Visit Fort Worth to the stage, and Miss Opal Lee, come on up.
So this is a huge honor for me. Miss Opal was one of the first people I met when I was in college. You know, when it was time to do service, they said, well, let me tell you, let me take you to a place over here on Rosedale at the Genealogical Society and meet these two ladies, Miss Opal Lee and Miss Rolla. And I tell you, as soon as we walked in the door, she put us to work. And I have been working tirelessly for Miss Opal and her husband, which was Dale Lee, one of my strong fraternity brothers, who I would go to their house. He would sit me down in the corner and tell me all the things I needed to do right. Miss Opal would come in and, you know, verify and even fix me something to eat, you know. So, you know, with great pleasure and honor, I present Miss Opal Blake Lee as an honorary member of the Rotary Club of Fort Worth.
Thank you, young people, and you're all young people if you're not 95. I'm delighted. I know about the good work you've been doing for years, and the fact that you were formed by a woman the year 26, when I was born. Hey, that gives me a great intro into what's going on here. Thank you again. Here, I'd stay up here all day telling you about what we're doing. That ain't what you want to hear. Thank you.
Well, we are honored to have you as a part of our club. You definitely epitomize service above self. So we are glad to have you in our club. And now I'll welcome to the stage Ms. Maddie Compton, retired federal prosecutor and now a community volunteer and activist. She's our chairperson of the day, and she will introduce our program.
Good afternoon. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. That's from the song Strange Fruit, written by Abel Mirapole and recorded in 1939 by Billie Holiday. A banner used to hang at the NAACP national headquarters. It stated, "A man was lynched yesterday." From 1882 to 1963, 4,743 lynchings occurred in the United States, according to records maintained by the NAACP, and many historians believe the true number is underreported. The highest number of lynchings during that time period occurred in Mississippi with 581 recorded, Georgia was second with 531, and Texas was third with 493. Black people were the primary victims of lynching, 3,446, or about 72% of the people lynched were Black. But they weren't the only victims of lynching. Some white people were lynched for helping Black people or for being anti-lynching. Immigrants from Mexico, China, Australia, and other countries were also lynched. You might think of lynchings as a disgraceful and barbaric practice from the past, but they continue to this day. In 1968, James Byrd was chained to a car by 3 white supremacists and dragged to his death in the streets of Jasper, Texas. In 2020, Ahmaud Arbery was fatally shot while jogging near Brunswick, Georgia. The 3 white men charged with killing Arbery were found guilty of his murder last week. The videotaped death of George Floyd was a modern-day lynching. Floyd was killed in broad daylight by convicted murderer, former police officer Derek Chauvin, who held Floyd down with a knee on his neck for more than 9 minutes. As we head into the second week of Advent, when we light the peace candle, these are disturbing facts, facts that we might want to turn away from. But in the words of James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Today, we will hear from Adam McKinney as he helps us to face one such horrific event that took place a century ago in our beloved Fort Worth, Texas. Adam McKinney wears many hats. He's an assistant professor of dance at TCU, and he danced professionally with some of the world's most prestigious dance companies. He, along with his husband, Daniel Banks, is the co-director and co-founder of DNA Works, an arts and service organization committed to healing through the arts and dialogue. He also sits on the board of Transform 1012 North Main Street, the local project to acquire and transform the former KKK auditorium on Main Street. And he is the president of Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice. Why don't you head on up this way, Adam? It's a local grassroots nonprofit organization that creates collaborative education-based opportunities to center the experiences of people of the global majority. He's a core faculty member at TCU in the Comparative Race and Studies, Ethnic Studies Department, and an affiliate faculty member for Women and Gender Studies Department. I give you Adam McKinney.
Good afternoon. I am moved by your friendship, and it already feels like home. And as we do at home, today I'm going to tell you the truth. I also think that it's important to notice that it is the holiday of Chanukah, and the root word of Chanukah is chinuch, which means education. Chanukah is the holiday of dedication, and so I dedicate this moment to education and to the life and legacy of Mr. Fred Rouse. Where am I pointing this? That way? All right, that's me with curly hair. Not quite working, team. Great, wonderful. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the next. Great. It's important to notice that we are on the unceded lands of multiple Native American nations, including the Cherokee and Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Kickapoo, Shawnee, Caddo, and Wichita, all of whom were forcibly removed from their homes by settler colonialism, and from which non-Native people now profit. Got it. These are my many hats that you spoke to, so I'll just move right on through. This is the agenda for today. Can someone read those words on the right-hand side for me? This afternoon, I would like us all to remember. And like the West African Adinkra symbol, the Sankofa, I feel that it's important to look back to history to better understand our present. With the Sankofa, the ancestors teach us to go back and get it. And by it, I think that they mean history, certainly, but also the reclamation of you, and also the reclamation of me, and also the reclamation of us together in this process of looking back to history. And to that end, I would like to offer this trigger warning. This afternoon, I'll be referencing and discussing Fort Worth's historical relationship to racial terror violence. And we must look back to history to remember, to literally and figuratively put back together its pieces in hopes of making sense of the past in order to make meaning and change in the present. I look back to Ida B. Wells, who was an investigative journalist, educator, anti-lynching activist, and one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And we continue to look back. I am reminded of this quote. Can somebody read this for me? I think about history and about the repercussions of memory. What happens when we remember? What truths come forth? And what must we recognize and what must we heal? I believe that we must remember that our Fort Worth, I think someone referenced Fort Worth as our Fort Worth, has a history of white supremacy. This history of white supremacy in Fort Worth does not sit external to the landscape of white supremacy in America as a whole. In fact, examining Fort Worth as a microcosm of white nationalism and white supremacist activity can help us determine potential solutions to ending oppression targeted at people of the global majority. The KKK in Fort Worth first organized themselves in October 1916 during the second iteration of the national KKK in the late teens and early 20s. This second Klan was more public and visible in their racist ideological practices. At the behest of the Fort Worth police commissioner, who wished for a Ku Klux Klan to lead the city's fall festival parade, a group of men, mostly police officers, were inducted into the first Fort Worth chapter of the KKK. They paraded in military formation downtown streets just here on Halloween night, all dressed in law enforcement regalia, some in ghostly white hoods, robes, and on horseback. There were many, many public KKK chapters across Texas, most for men, some for women, and even some for children. This children's group was called the Ku Klux Kiddies, and it was a camp in Lake Worth. They even had a major city league baseball team. Many adult members of the Klan held prominent positions in the community in Fort Worth, including in politics, religion, law, business, medicine, finance, education, and law enforcement. Fort Worth, Texas in particular had several auxiliary groups and chapters, and a main chapter known as KKK Claver number 101, which was one of the largest, if not the largest, claverns in the state and in the United States in the early 1920s. This is an image of the KKK Claver number 101, so take care of yourself in the way that you need to take care of yourself as I show this image. KKK Clever number 101 was so strong and so popular that they built a huge auditorium in 1924 and 25 to house meetings, rallies, initiations, speakers, and performances, including minstrel shows in blackface. The auditorium was in use by the KKK until 1931, when KKK membership dwindled due to a series of sex scandals, internal battles over power, and newspaper exposés, which quickly reduced the group's influence. When we examine the histories of systematic annihilations of groups of people, for example, the Holocaust, lynchings, the 1994 Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi, I look at this ADL pyramid of hate, which outlines the justification of bias by seeking out like-minded people to accept negative information about other groups of people, purporting said bias as truth. In effect, justifying bias can lead directly to genocide. Performances of white supremacy and white nationalism are powerful tools to bring ideologies of hate, terror, fear, and hegemony intact. Which brings me to a story about Mr. Fred Rouse. And I use a versus the to denote that Mr. Rouse was much more than a victim of racial terror lynching. Mr. Fred Rouse was a non-union worker for Swift and Company in the stockyards. It was then known as Niles City, the richest, littlest town in the United States. In 1920, a strike ensued in the stockyards when union laborers demanded higher wages. In response, stockyard slaughterhouse owners hired Black, Latino, and early European immigrants to perform union jobs for lower pay and longer hours. This, of course, created tension between union and non-union laborers, and white union laborers blamed these non-union laborers for stealing their jobs. And I think that that narrative and that lexicon of other people stealing our jobs continues to this day. This pressure led to fanatical outrage, and on Tuesday, December 6th, 1921, at about 4:30 p.m., when he was leaving work, and we believe that Mr. Rouse worked at the slaughterhouse at the corner of Northeast 23rd and Niles City Boulevard. He was threatened and accosted by stockyard strikers and agitators. One yelled, "You won't be back here tomorrow." And Mr. Rouse said, "I will be back here at 7 o'clock in the morning. I bet you $100. And historically, we know what happens when Black people stand in their power, especially in 1920. Mr. Rouse was shoved and then stabbed. As he defended himself from the crowd, a struggle ensued, and Mr. Rouse was accused of shooting 2 white men. A mob then began to beat and bludgeon Mr. Rouse with a streetcar guardrail. With his skull fractured in 2 places, internal injuries, and several stab wounds, Mr. Rouse was left for dead in the middle of Exchange Avenue. Who here has been to the stockyards? We have. And we know Exchange Avenue. And this is where Mr. Rouse was first attacked. Niles City police officers asked the mob to relinquish Mr. Rouse to law enforcement. And I stress the word relinquish. They placed Mr. Rouse's body in the back of a police car, and on the way to the mortuary, discovering that he was still alive, they drove him south to the city and county hospital Negro ward in the basement. It's just here on East 3rd and Jones Street. 5 days later, while Mr. Rouse was recovering from his injuries, another mob of approximately 30 masked white men entered the hospital on Sunday, December 11th, 1921. The 100th anniversary is in exactly 8 days. They threatened the hospital staff, forced their way into the Negro ward, kidnapped Mr. Rouse in his hospital gown, and they identified him by feeling the back of his head because they knew that his skull had been fractured in 2 places. And they drove north on Samuels Avenue to what had become known as the Death Tree at Northeast 12th Street and Samuels Avenue. From this tree pictured, this hackberry tree, the mob hanged Mr. Rouse. The mob shot Mr. Rouse 8 times after he was hanged. And according to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the body of Mr. Rouse was riddled with bullets. A bloody gun was left below his feet. I think that it was a symbol for our city and for Black people in our city in particular. And we know Samuels Avenue there, or I hope that you might know and check out the location. There's a hill that goes down to Samuels Avenue North. And likely hundreds of people drove up and down Samuels Avenue to watch Mr. Rouse hang from a hackberry tree and to watch his blood let through his city and county hospital gown, his broken body leaking from the death tree was a doleful reminder and libation to the long, inevitable future of Black bodies disoriented by white supremacist violence. Mr. Rouse was buried in New Trinity Cemetery in Haltom City the next day, on Monday, December 12th, 1921, and little is known about his burial, or even if he had a ceremony. No headstone for Mr. Rouse has been located. 6 white men were charged in the murder of Mr. Rouse, including one who once had a bar named after him in the stockyards, and 3 of whom who were law enforcement officers. One of those people became the chief of police for Niles City. All were released because of lack of evidence, and no one was ever convicted in the murder of Mr. Rouse. I believe that 100 years later, that we must all be held accountable for the racial terror murder of Mr. Fred Rouse. To participate in the historic authenticity of the cultural archive that is Fort Worth, our Fort Worth, we as a city have a responsibility to look back and to take lead on enacting social change in the present by remembering and by reconciling this history. As we look back to put back together the pieces, literally remembering Mr. Rouse's dismemberment, We get to notice that the trauma that occurred the cold evening of December 11th, 1921, continues to live on in our historical and cultural memory. We also get to notice that it is not only Black communities nor communities of the global majority that suffer the effects of historical and contemporary racism. It is not only communities of the global majority that have been racialized. We have all been racialized. We have all been separated from one another. And race has been that justification. All communities are affected by the mistreatment of another. No one is immune. I would like to welcome now Mr. Fred Rouse III, who is an executive board member of Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice and the grandson of Mr. Fred Rouse, to offer a community response. Mr. Rouse.
Good evening to everybody. Adam, I'll say thank you. You spoke very eloquently and beautifully regarding my grandfather's story. I'm a man of few words, but I just want to say thank you for having me here. And the story about my grandfather, Mr. Fred Rouse, is a very tragic story. But I'm glad that his word, his story, his legacy is getting out, and he's been honored for what he went through. So many of African Americans have, visited the same fate that he did throughout the years. And with my grandfather's story getting out, I think one of the biggest reasons why we want to get this story out is because we want to start to heal. And his story is very tragic. So with that, even standing here now, it's hard for me to talk about it. So please bear with me. With his story, being as tragic as it is, a lot of people don't realize and understand that he was a father, he was a husband. My biological dad, which is Fred Rouse Jr., Mr. Fred Rouse's son, he died when I was 12 years old. So I never really got a chance to know that side of my family. And I always ask the question, why is that? Because this tragedy was so painful to my dad, Fred Rouse Jr., he never shared the story with my mom or anybody else in the family. And hearing how tragic his father died, now we know why. But this story, this tragedy that's happened in my family, has happened in so many families across the world. And even to this very day, African Americans are being gunned down in the street unarmed, killed in their own homes, just playing with their relatives. And I'm here to say right now today, we have to stop this, we have to change. There has to be something that we can do to heal the pain and the tragedies that has gone on for so many years. And we're at the forefront now, and we all in this room can make that change. We can stop the hate. Just because of somebody's color of their skin does not mean that they're a bad person, does not mean that they're an evil person, because we can all get along and we can all make that change. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. I am inspired by the work of attorney Sherilyn A. Eiffel, who in 2003 urged us all to take lead in creating regional and national truth and reconciliation commissions for lynching. In response to Attorney Eiffel's charge, I'd like to share with you today some projects that Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice has planned to memorialize Mr. Fred Rouse 100 years later. I'm going to use the acronym because to say Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice 10 times over gets a little tiring. TCCPJ works closely with the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. You may have heard of the director of the organization, Mr. Brian Stevenson. EJI houses the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Some people know it as the National Lynching Memorial, and their Legacy Museum. In 2019, TCCPJ led a soil collection ceremony whereby community members extracted soil from the site of the racial terror lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse. One jar remains here in Fort Worth. Another jar is included in their library of other jars of soil used as a tool of remembrance. I referenced the building on North Main Street, the former Ku Klux Klan Clavern number 101 auditorium. I'm the co-secretary of a project called Transform 1012 North Main Street, and it's a project to acquire the building and transform it into what will be known as the Fred Rouse Center and Museum for Arts and Community Healing. We have co-convened a group on the project. Dr. Opal Lee is one of the leaders of that project. I honor you, Dr. Lee, in the collaboration. In this collaboration, we model as a contradiction to histories of racism, locally and in the world. We model a pluricultural and shared leadership approach to securing, to programming, and to managing the space. And in so doing, we bring together groups of people in Fort Worth that are systemically isolated and targeted for oppression. The goals of the project are to reassemble the city by returning power to groups targeted for oppression, to make the Fred Rouse Center and Museum for Arts and Community Healing a site of memory, a place for the whole city to come together to wrestle with our history and build a collective way forward toward liberation, and to transform our city by transforming this building. TCCPJ has a whole series of events planned to memorialize Mr. Fred Rouse. Beginning tomorrow, we'll lead 2 tours. Fort Worth Lynching Tour, honoring the memory of Mr. Fred Rouse, is a bike tour and a car tour to sites associated with the racial terror lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse. And we take members on the tour in reverse, to not re-perform the memory, not to re-perform the trauma. Time is compressed like a coil, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. There's a compression of time, and our goal with the work is to undo by reversing the coil so that we can identify the ways in which we want to be change agents in the world by investigating the history more specifically. That's this weekend. We'll be holding a prayer vigil for reconciliation in the stockyards. Thank you, Councilman Flores, for all your support on that. And we'll be holding a Memorial March for Justice downtown Fort Worth from the Tarrant County Courthouse, where those 4 gentlemen were tried and led off to the Mr. Fred Rouse Memorial. Excuse me. On December 11th at 11:30, we are holding a memorial marker unveiling. This is a project of the Chamber of Performing Arts Fort Worth and of Tarrant County Coalition for Truth and Justice. This will be the first time that the historical marker is going up at this site to memorialize Mr. Fred Rouse. This is an image of the historical marker that will be unveiled. And we will have the Mr. Fred Rouse Memorial groundbreaking ceremony on December 11th at 1 p.m. at 1000 Northeast 12th Street, and we welcome you to come and remember. We received a grant, a generous grant from the Rainwater Charitable Foundation to purchase the site of the lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse. And we have a plan to transform the traumatic space into one of liberation, community, and healing. So on Saturday, we'll have the groundbreaking, and we welcome you. We are working with Design Jones to design the eventual space. They are a company that has experience leading this work around the transformation of sites of trauma into sites of community and remembrance. And so we're really excited to be working with them. And they are out of they're out of Arlington, Texas. And lastly, we will be installing an Equal Justice Initiative historical marker at the site of the racial terror lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse as part of the groundbreaking ceremony. I welcome you. I invite you. I urge you to remember. But I also welcome you, invite you, urge you to build relationships with people from whom you've been separated. We are each other's best resource. I care about you deeply. And we at TCCPJ do this work with care and with a slow tempo. Excuse me if I was speaking quickly before. As a way to subvert all of the ways in which we've been separated as people. And I thank you for your attention to this matter and to identifying the ways in which you would like to reconcile this history. What do you want to do about it? And how would you like to activate justice? Thank you again. Appreciate you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for sharing that history. That was a very heavy topic. But as you know, Rotary is an organization that seeks peace through better friendships and fellowship with each other. So take time to get to know one another and let us all be change agents for healing to move forward. And with that, we are adjourned.